I had a YouTube channel for 7 years, from 2016 to 2022. Beginning of 2022, I came to a realization after 7 years of YouTube channel, and I was trying to help the Divine Feminine learn some principles which I thought could be learned. And after 7 years of struggling, and towards the end of the 7 years struggling so hard with the Divine Feminine and ultimately with the collective, the Divine Feminine, it turned into fighting it. So after the 7th year, I came to the realization that I was in some kind of an absolute power struggle with the Divine Feminine collective, and it was ridiculous because, see, I didn't want to be fighting anyone, especially any women, and it was absolutely not my intention to be not able to help them after 7 years, but even worse, fighting with them utterly and totally, completely, chaotically. So after 7 years, I came to the realization that there was a dark goddess, and she didn't want to learn. She wasn't gonna learn anything, and ultimately her attitude was like a goddess that was an actual goddess, so supreme. She was gonna rule the men, and basically she didn't accept that men could possibly rule her or tell her to do anything. It's ultimately she's the boss, and period, end of story, or else. And ultimately, how could you teach her anything then? And I realized that, like, wow, okay, well, I just wasted 7 years. But I didn't waste any time, really, because not only did I learn after 7 years that it was ridiculous to even think I could do it, because if I couldn't do it in 77 years, couldn't do it, or 7,000 years, it wasn't going to happen. Because after 7 years, I realized there's no way she doesn't want to learn. She refuses to learn, but it's worse than that. She's absolutely making her whole purpose to be Queen Supreme, and that's it, nothing else. And so I actually discovered what I was doing was fighting with the Divine Feminine. Towards the end of the 7 years, it would turn into ridiculousness. And after I thought I was wasting my time, I ended up finding out, talking to God, because God talked to me and He told me. And literally, just understand, God did tell me what I'm about to tell you. And He said that, you didn't really waste the 7 years, because in Troy, the same exact thing happened. The 10 years of the Trojan War, there were 7 years. In the 7th year, the same exact thing happened. So they were fighting for 7 years, just like I had my YouTube channel for 7 years. And in the 7th year, when I learned that they're not going to ever learn and it's a waste of time, well, I ended up thinking it was a waste of time until God came to me, and it was the first time. I understand that it took a time after that before I really figured all this out. It's taken a long time to figure this stuff out, and understand that it wasn't like I knew everything all the time. It took me a long time to figure this stuff out, and I've only now come to conclusions and realizations that are so profound and earth-shaking. And one of them is God came out and told me, isn't that something? And He said that in the 7-year war of Troy, in the 7th year, the Trojan men came to a conclusion that the women weren't going to get it, and they'd been fighting for 7 years, and basically the women weren't going to get it, and the Trojan men declared the women like not fit for, they're wrong. And ultimately this struggling and squabbling between the men and women of Troy turned into something where the Trojan men literally egotistically became very egocentric, and just denied the wives, and just absolutely would just treat them like terrible, or beat them up, or the Trojan men went kind of crazy and berserk and absolutely turned on their wives permanently. And ultimately, it would seem like you could blame whoever you can blame, but the fact was, in the Trojan War, the gods and the goddesses went to war, and it wasn't really a war that was fought between people, although it was. it was fought between gods and goddesses on Mount Olympus, and then the people were also under the influence of those gods and goddesses, and that's why they fought as well. Which means that the whole struggle down on earth was about the whole struggle up in heaven, and up in heaven, the struggle was between the goddesses and the gods. Now, during the war of Troy, many of the goddesses died. They were killed by the gods. And those goddesses that died would be made to come to earth and be human. And the gods some of the gods that died would also be reborn as humans. So they would be made to have to relearn everything. And basically, they would be made to have to learn their lesson, whatever their lesson was. Yeah, their punishment was, you're going to be a human now. You can't be a god anymore. And ultimately, it's the worst kind of punishment. You know, when you're a god and then you lose your god status and you go to human status, well, it's terrible because humans die. And the body ages and it's painful and we suffer. Ultimately, it's terrible to be a human, and what I discovered was what God told me, more of what God told me, and ultimately I'm happy to get it, and I'm excited to know the information, but ultimately what I was told was so earth-shaking and earth-shattering and shocking that ultimately, wow. So the thing is that if the men came down here on earth and the goddesses came down here on earth and they were turning into humans, well, basically they're not told anything, so they don't know anything, and they're going to have a chance to learn their lesson, whatever it is, and each one will have, there's a different judgment on them, which means that they could each one be learning a different lesson. Now, Athena, the goddess, she was killed, and she was killed for killing Hermes. She was killed for killing Hermes. Now, understand that Hermes was ultimately killed on Artemis's orders, and what Artemis told Athena and Minerva, and basically, Minerva might have killed Hermes, but basically Hermes the god was murdered by either Minerva or Athena, and Artemis is why, because it was on Artemis what Artemis had to say. Something Hermes did so badly that he deserved to die as a god. And Hermes was up on Mount Olympus. He was up on a mountain pass, and he was waiting for Helinus, a prince of Troy, who was a survivor. He was a brother of Hector. He was waiting for him to come up that mountain pass so he could warn him that if he thought that he could trust Minerva, the goddess, that you better think twice because you'll be dead but you're not going to survive if you go wherever you're going right now. And ultimately Hermes was following Minerva, and Minerva had told Hermes that it was a secret mission. And the secret mission was Minerva had made friends with with Helinus, who was an augur and a high priest of Apollo. And so he was the highest priest of Apollo. He was the one at the top, like, the Pope of Apollo, literally. And Apollo, the god of the sun. And so he was an important prince of Troy. He was an augur. He was a fortune teller. He was also in charge of the 3rd Battalion of the Trojan army. And he fought alongside his brother Hector in the war, in battle many times. And he was a good fighter. And he didn't like fighting, though. And he got injured by Menelaus, the brother of King Agamemnon, who basically shot an arrow at him, and it went through his hand and stuck into the bow, and so he got injured. His elbow got pierced by an arrow from Menelaus, and he had to be out of the battle at that point and heal, and he never went back. He ended up never going back to battle, and that was during the war. So Helinus was one of the people that would actually be taking over for the line of Trojans, because Hector had been killed, Priam had been killed, all the Trojan king and all the higher brothers he was a younger prince that happened to be left, and there was very few of them left. So Minerva hated the Trojans and didn't want any of them to survive because she wanted to kill off the entire literal line. And so Minerva befriended Helinus and acted nice to him, and he loved her, and he couldn't believe a goddess would talk to him. So he was absolutely happy about it, and he was like beside himself because he thought, like, well, Apollo is a great god of the sun, and I love being a high priest of Apollo, and he was a great loyal high priest of Apollo. And in fact, Apollo would say that he was not only the most loyal priest of mine, but he was the favorite priest of mine, and for all time, not just in one lifetime or any lifetime, from all the time that I've been around. He was my most loyal priest I ever had, ever. So ultimately, that's what I'm saying. He felt special because he really was loyal to his God. He loved his God, and he was going to be protecting his God's integrity to the death, and he would do it. So basically, he could be trusted. And ultimately, Minerva came to him. So now he had a goddess coming to him, and he was like, wow, this is great. I'm lucky. And well, it turns out that she said that, can you deliver some messages? And this is where it started, was before Hector got killed and Priam got killed. This is like earlier on when she started contacting Helinus, and the Prince of Troy got to talk to a goddess and have doings with her, which was rare, and he loved it, and he felt privileged, and he loved her. He really thought Minerva was great. And ultimately, Minerva was the enemy. And because he was a go-between, he would go tell his dad, Priam, the king of Troy, and he'd have dinner with Hector, and then he'd tell him, Minerva, the goddess of the enemy, she says this, or she says that. So he'd deliver messages. And so then Hector and Priam could say, well, whatever they would, they get the communication from him. And he became what he thought was friends with Minerva. And ultimately, she betrayed him, but it was worse than that, because she actually asked him to go on a secret mission for her and convinced them to, after the 7 years, after 7 years, the men of Troy completely split up with their wives, and they ultimately declared it it was destroyed. Troy was destroyed in the 7th or 8th year before the end of the war, because the structure and the cohesion of the Trojan husbands and wives was just shot, and there was no more Troy in the 8th or 9th year. That basically the family structure had broken entirely down to the point of no return, or to the point of stuck anger, and ultimately there was no husband getting along with any wife, and they were beating their wives, killing their wives, and the wives were poisoning their husbands, and there was all kinds of chaos. So it was over, and Helinus knew it, and he knew that Troy is gone, and this is shot. And ultimately what he knew, the most of what he knew, was that the Trojan men had made an error that was critically bad. They had gotten rid of the god when they got rid of Athena. Athena was a god, and if you got rid of the goddess, and it didn't come from Zeus, then it came from Hera. And ultimately, however, the Trojans got rid of Artemis and Venus, because there was a betrayal of the wives fighting them, and ultimately they had to get rid of the goddesses. Goddesses were out of control up on Mount Olympus fighting the gods, and the wives were being out of control on their husbands. So they declared it over with, and now Troy was over with. There was no family structure or anything, and so the Trojan men made an error that they actually got rid of Athena too. Well, Athena's a god, not a goddess. Athena came from her forehead of her dad Zeus. Basically, from his forehead, she was born. And ultimately, what that means is that she came from her dad, and she was her dad. So Athena was a god. And so Helinus had told them, and ultimately, Helinus went on a secret mission for Minerva to help the Greeks sack Troy, since Helinus wanted it to end. He knew it was destroyed. Most of everybody was killed. All his brothers, everybody. There was so many dead. Nobody was in. Troy was destroyed anyways, and he wanted to get it over with. And ultimately, the goddesses convinced him that the Trojan men have gotten rid of us, and the Greeks actually have both us and the god. So don't you see how there has to be two? There can't be just a god or just a goddess. And ultimately he agreed. Well, that sounds reasonable, because we need to have a cohesion love relationship between husband and wife. There has to be a goddess and a god getting along together. They can't just get rid of the goddess. So Helinus was trying to be on Minerva's side, even though she's the enemy, coming to him and telling him, now let's go up and do a secret mission. Now he made the error of his life, and it was